Prisons are supposed to be the final barrier between violence and society. They exist to remove dangerous individuals from the streets and place them under absolute control. Monitored, restricted, neutralized. Concrete walls, iron bars, armed guards, surveillance systems. Everything about a prison is meant to send one message. Inside these walls, the state is in control. But history has shown something far more disturbing. When corruption replaces authority, prisons do not stop violence. They reorganize it. They become places where power shifts, hierarchies form, and brutality adapts to a new environment. On the night of February 19th, 2012, inside a prison in northern Mexico, that transformation reached its most extreme form. By sunrise, 44 men were dead, 37 inmates had escaped, and the Mexican government was forced to confront a truth it had spent years avoiding. This was not a riot. This was not spontaneous chaos. This was not prisoners losing control. This was a prison that had already been lost, long before the first man was killed. The world outside the walls. To understand what happened inside Apodaca prison, you first need to understand what Mexico was living through at the time. By 2012, the country was deep into what many called a low-intensity war. Drug cartels were no longer just trafficking organizations. They had become paramilitary forces. Entire regions were contested territories. Police departments were infiltrated. Politicians were threatened, bribed, or assassinated. And when cartel members were arrested, they did not leave that power behind. They brought it with them, into the prison system. Mexican prisons were not designed to handle organized crime on this scale. They were designed for punishment, not for containment. The reality of Mexican prisons. In many parts of Mexico, prisons function less like state institutions and more like negotiated spaces. Overcrowding was extreme. Facilities designed for a few hundred inmates often held double or triple that number. Guards were poorly paid, poorly trained, and constantly exposed to danger. In this environment, enforcing rules became risky. Refusing a bribe could mean retaliation. Stopping the wrong inmate could mean death. So a system developed, unofficial, illegal, but tolerated. Inmates paid for privileges, better food, access to phones, protection, freedom of movement. Those with money and cartel backing lived differently from everyone else. Power inside prison walls was no longer determined by the state. It was determined by criminal hierarchy. Apodaca Prison, a facility on the edge. The Centro de Readaptación Social de Apodaca was located in the state of Nuevo León, just outside the city of Monterrey. On paper, it was a medium security prison. In reality, it was overwhelmed. By early 2012, Apodaca was severely overcrowded. Cells built for a handful of inmates were packed far beyond capacity. Security systems were outdated. Surveillance cameras had blind spots. Staff shortages were constant. Guards worked long hours under immense pressure. And most importantly, the prison housed members of rival cartels. Cartels do not disappear behind bars. Prison does not erase cartel loyalty. It intensifies it. Inside Apodaca, two major criminal organizations dominated daily life: Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel. Outside the prison, these groups were engaged in one of the most violent conflicts in Mexico's history. Inside Apodaca, that war was temporarily frozen, but never resolved. Cell blocks became territories. Movement inside the prison required permission, not from guards, but from inmate leaders. Guards maintained a fragile peace by negotiating with both sides. But peace built on fear and corruption is unstable by nature. Los Zetas, discipline and brutality. Los Zetas were not a traditional cartel. They were known for military discipline, extreme violence, and strict internal control. Many of their members were former soldiers or police officers. Inside prison, they operated with the same structure they used on the streets. Hierarchy orders enforcement disobedience was punished immediately, and that discipline gave them power. The Gulf Cartel, numbers and territory. The Gulf Cartel, on the other hand, relied on numbers and long-established networks. They had deep roots in northern Mexico. Inside Apodaca, they controlled significant portions of the prison population, but they lacked the same level of internal discipline as Los Zetas. This imbalance mattered because when violence came, it would not be random. Warning signs that no one stopped. Weeks before the massacre, tensions inside Apodaca were escalating. Inmates reported threats. Guards noticed increased hostility. There were whispers of retaliation. Some inmates requested transfers, but acknowledging the problem would have required admitting something dangerous, that the prison was no longer under state control, and so nothing changed. No separation of rival factions, no reinforcement of security, no intervention. The system chose denial. The night shift. On February 19, 2012, Apodaca Prison followed its usual nighttime routine. Lights were dimmed, cells were locked, guards began the night shift. Officially, everything was normal. Unofficially, it was anything but. Shortly after midnight, something happened that should have been impossible. A group of inmates affiliated with Los Zetas were allowed to leave their cells. No alarm sounded. No emergency protocols were activated. Security doors opened quietly. And with that single act, Apodaca stopped functioning as a prison. Not a riot, a plan. What followed was not chaos. It was coordination. The attackers were armed with knives, clubs, and improvised weapons, items that could only exist inside the prison with the knowledge of staff. They moved calmly, deliberately. They avoided unnecessary noise. This was not rage. This was preparation. Targets already chosen. Their targets were clear. Members of the Gulf Cartel, many of them locked inside their cells, asleep, defenseless. Cell doors were opened, some by force, others already unlocked. Inside those cells, violence unfolded quickly. There was no escape. The first deaths. The first men to die were attacked at close range. Blunt force trauma, stab wounds, strangulation. There were no warnings, no negotiations. This was not a fight, it was an execution. And it was only the beginning. The prison falls silent as the first inmates were attacked. Something deeply unnatural settled over Apodaca Prison. Silence. Not the normal silence of a prison at night. Distant noises, metal echoes, voices behind walls. But an intentional silence. No alarms echoed through the corridors. No warning sirens cut through the darkness. No rapid response team rushed in. For a prison holding hundreds of inmates, this absence of reaction was impossible to ignore. And it was deliberate. Moving through the cell blocks. The attackers moved from block to block with precision. They knew exactly where to go. They knew which cells to open. They knew who was inside. This was not random violence. This was intelligence. In several cases, cell doors were already unlocked, something that should never have happened during night hours. In other cases, doors were opened without resistance. Witnesses later described attackers calling out names before striking. There was no confusion, only certainty. Inside the cells. Inside the cramped cells, victims had nowhere to run. Some were attacked while sleeping, others woke just long enough to realize what was happening. The weapons were simple but effective. Knives fashioned from metal scraps, wooden clubs, bare hands used to strangle. Forensic reports would later reveal multiple forms of trauma on many bodies, signs that the violence was not only fatal, but personal. This was not about speed, it was about dominance. Bodies left behind. As the killings continued, bodies began to accumulate. Some victims were left where they fell, inside their cells. Others were dragged into hallways and common areas. In certain sections, bodies were stacked. Not out of necessity, but intention. The message was unmistakable. This was meant to be seen. Hours without intervention. Perhaps the most chilling fact of that night is how long the violence lasted. Not minutes, hours. During that time, guards did not initiate a full lockdown. No external law enforcement was immediately deployed. No medical response was allowed inside. The prison functioned as if the killings were invisible. Later investigations would confirm what many already suspected. Guards knew exactly what was happening. The role of fear. Some guards would later claim they were paralyzed by fear. Los Zetas had reputations that extended far beyond prison walls. Threats were not limited to the guards themselves, but to their families. Refusing orders inside the prison could mean retaliation outside of it. But fear alone does not explain everything, because fear does not unlock doors. Fear does not escort inmates. Fear does not disable security systems. Corruption in motion. Evidence later revealed that guards had actively facilitated movement inside the prison. Security checkpoints were bypassed. Internal gates were opened. Critical moments were absent from surveillance footage. This was not negligence. It was cooperation. Some guards admitted they were paid. Others claimed they were coerced. But the result was the same. The massacre was allowed to continue uninterrupted. The distraction. While inmates were being hunted and killed, another operation was underway, and this one was quieter. In a separate section of the prison, select inmates were being moved toward exits. No violence, no resistance, no alarms, just open gates. The escape. By the time authorities realized something was wrong, 37 inmates had escaped. They did not dig tunnels. They did not overpower guards. They walked out. Among them were high-ranking cartel members, men with connections, resources, and the ability to disappear quickly. The massacre had served its purpose. While attention focused on the dead, the living vanished. Dawn at Apakeda. As morning approached, the violence finally stopped. Not because guards intervened, but because the objective had been achieved. When daylight entered the prison, the scale of what had happened became undeniable. 44 bodies, blood-stained floors, cells destroyed from the inside. The prison was no longer functioning. It was a crime scene. Families gather outside. Word spread quickly beyond the prison walls. Families of inmates rushed to the facility, desperate for information. Names were not released. Officials refused to answer questions. Outside the gates, chaos grew. Parents, wives, siblings, all demanding to know if their loved ones were alive. Inside, bodies were still being identified. The first official statement. Authorities finally addressed the media. They described the event as a fight between rival inmates, a disturbance, a loss of control. But the explanation immediately raised questions. How could a simple fight result in 44 deaths? Why were all the victims from the same cartel? Why were guards silent for hours? The official narrative was already falling apart. Journalists began asking questions. Mexican journalists quickly began investigating. They spoke to former inmates, they analyzed security layouts, they questioned the escape. And one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not a riot, it was an execution. The government under pressure. Public outrage grew. International media began covering the story. The Mexican government could no longer minimize the incident. An official investigation was announced. But trust was already damaged. People weren't just asking how this happened. They were asking how long it had been happening. Arrests begin. Under mounting pressure, authorities arrested 18 prison guards. Some were charged with aiding escape, abuse of authority, complicity. Others were questioned and released. Several high-ranking officials were quietly removed from their positions, but critics argued that the investigation focused on low-level actors. The architects of the massacre remained invisible. The limits of justice trials moved slowly. Sentences were limited. Many guards claimed they acted under threat. Others claimed orders came from above. Responsibility became diluted. And as often happens in cases involving organized crime, the truth fragmented. Apakeda as a symbol. The Apodaca prison massacre became more than a single event. It became a symbol of what happens when criminal power infiltrates state institutions, a symbol of what happens when prisons stop being controlled by law and start being controlled by fear. A question that remained. As investigations dragged on, one question remained unanswered. If this could happen in Apodaca, how many other prisons were already lost? The investigation that could not go too far. In the days following the Apodaca prison massacre, the Mexican government faced a dilemma. On one hand, public pressure demanded answers. On the other, those answers risked exposing a truth far more dangerous than a single violent night. Because Apodaca was not an isolated failure. It was a reflection of a system already compromised. Official investigations focused on what could be proven quickly: guards opening doors, escorts provided to escaping inmates, failures in protocol. 18 guards were arrested, several officials were removed from their posts, but the investigation stopped where it became politically and institutionally uncomfortable. No deep inquiry into cartel influence at higher levels. No public identification of prison power brokers. No acknowledgement of how long the prison had operated under informal criminal control. The system investigated itself and protected itself. Who benefited from Apocada? The massacre achieved two objectives. First, it eliminated dozens of rival cartel members inside the prison. Second, it freed key inmates who would return to criminal operations outside. From a strategic perspective, it was devastatingly effective. Los Zetas strengthened their position both inside and outside prison walls. The Gulf Cartel lost manpower, leadership, and territory. This was not random violence, it was strategic violence. The failure of the prison model. Apodaca forced experts to confront a difficult reality. Mexican prisons were never designed to contain organizations like Los Zetas. They were designed for individuals. But cartels function as networks. They adapt. They infiltrate. They exploit weak points. And prisons filled with overcrowding, underpaid staff, and corruption offered plenty of weak points. Why guards became complicit? It is easy to label the guards as villains, but the reality is more complex, and more disturbing. Many guards lived in the same communities targeted by cartels. Their families were known, their salaries were low, their protection was minimal. Refusing a bribe or order could mean death, not only for them, but for their loved ones. The state asked them to enforce the law without giving them the means to survive doing it. That does not excuse their actions, but it explains why the system was so easily compromised. Reforms that came too late. In the aftermath, authorities announced reforms. Security protocols were revised, some prisons were restructured, surveillance systems were upgraded. But critics pointed out that these changes addressed symptoms, not causes. Corruption remained, overcrowding continued, and cartel influence persisted. Apodaca was closed years later, but by then, the damage had already been done. The human cost. Behind the statistics were real people. 44 inmates died violent deaths. Families received little information, little closure, and limited compensation. 37 escaped prisoners returned to communities, some never recaptured. Each escape represented potential future victims. The cost of Apodaca extended far beyond prison walls. Public trust shattered. For many Mexicans, Apodaca confirmed their worst fears. That state institutions were losing control. That prisons were not places of justice, but extensions of cartel power. That accountability was selective. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. Apocada was a warning. The massacre should have been a turning point, a moment of reckoning, a moment to confront systemic failure honestly. Instead, it became another chapter in a long history of partial truths and limited accountability. Similar incidents would follow in other prisons. The warning was heard, but not fully acted upon. The bigger question. Apodaca raises a question that extends beyond Mexico. What happens when the institutions designed to enforce the law become vulnerable to the very forces they are meant to contain? When prisons no longer isolate violence but organize it? The answer is uncomfortable. The state does not collapse all at once. It erodes. Final thoughts. When silence becomes complicity, the Apodaca prison massacre was not just about criminals killing criminals. It was about silence. The silence of guards who did not act. The silence of institutions that looked away. The silence that allowed violence to operate unchecked. That night, the prisoners were not locked in. The state was locked out. And when the state loses control of its prisons, it loses control of far more than walls and cells. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more in-depth criminal cases from around the world. These stories are not told to glorify violence, but to understand how systems fail and what happens when they do.